Welcome everybody to Hafid's travel series, Take a Second Look. As you know, this week the Chicago Club is taking a look at Dana Point and San Clemente. So first we're going to take a look at Dana Point and some of the history, and as we do our video, I think it'll have more meaning for you. So first of all, Dana Point is named after this gentleman in the slide, Richard Henry Dana. He was educated in Harvard in Boston area, and he wanted to explore and have an adventure. So he went aboard the Pilgrim, he went around Cape Horn, and he went all the way up and down the California coast. And what they were doing is they were looking for hides. The hide trade, the hides were called California banknotes. They were very important to the local economy. In fact, Richard Henry Dana called the Capistrano area the most romantic spot in California. You can see a replica of his ship, the Pilgrim, on the right-hand side. Sadly, that ship sank. I hope they can restore it because it's a wonderful historical amenity for the people in the area. And of course, the school children spend the night on the Pilgrim and they learn what it would be like to be a sailor back in those days. The sailor at the bottom is called a drower. He is throwing the hides off the cliff to the ships. So Richard Henry Dana, who wrote the famous book on California history 2 years before the mast. But the story of Dana Point is actually interesting beyond Richard Henry Dana. Back in 1923, Harry Chandler, one of the founders of the LA Times, founded a real estate syndicate, and they wanted to develop the Hollywood Hills. And they called it Hollywood Land. Of course, you take the land away and there you have the famous sign. Well, one of the famous individuals in the group was Sidney Woodruff. He was in the Dana Point syndicate. And the investors decided that Dana Point would make a beautiful Spanish village by the sea. So he and the developers set out and they platted, meaning they laid out the streets and the roads, and they built a number of homes in the Spanish colonial style. And he even started to build a large Dana Point Inn. But sitting there above the cliff, it looked like an absolutely perfect place to be. He built 35 homes, and then he started to build a magnificent Spanish colonial hotel called the Dana Point Inn, right on the cliff above Dana Point. But sadly, it fell victim to the Depression, and he had to abandon construction in 1939. You can see where the hotel was originally designed on the bluffs, and we will go there on our video series, and you can see the foundation. They still have the foundation. You might want to see where my cursor is. That's the original foundation of the 1930s Dana Point Inn. This is the Spanish colonial revival style that was consistent with what Sidney Woodruff wanted. This is his 1929 home, which is still in Dana Point today. Interestingly enough, Dana Point is also very famous for surfing. It had this incredible surf break called Killer Dana. Now you can see the headlands on the right, the peninsula that sticks out, and when the waves were just right, a south swell from Mexico, the waves would come in and it was a very, very long ride. Of course, the rocks made it Killer Dana. Look at this ride. Some of the rides were as long as a minute or a minute and a half. You can see this surfer here that I'm circling has a beautiful right all the way in. But of course, progress happens and developers decided that this would make a great marina. So in 1960, the Army Corps of Engineers came in and they built the breakwater all along here, and they dredged the place that used to be called Killer Dana, and it's now a beautiful marina. They have whale watching, they have restaurants, and they have plenty of slips for boats. This area is called Baby Beach. It's super gentle. It's a great place to learn to paddleboard. But of course, the surfers will never forget that this replaced Killer Dana. In fact, Hobie Alter opened up the first surf shop in California in Dana Point. And this is where they constructed sailboats and surfboards. So Dana Point has quite a surfing history. Now it has Doheny State Park, which has really gentle waves. Anyway, Dana Point began to grow and grow, and from 1970 to 1992, Dana Point adopted a Cape Cod style of architecture because they thought it would be reminiscent of Richard Henry Dana and New England and the whale watching. Because as you know, the gray whales come up and down the coast, and there's a whale festival in Dana Point. So they adopted this style, which was different than the Spanish colonial style that Sidney Woodruff favored and that San Clemente favored. But unfortunately for Dana Point, well, I guess you could say fortunately and unfortunately, it grew very, very fast. The city of Dana Point didn't incorporate until 1989. And you can see how fast it grew from 1960 to 1990. You can see also how fast San Clemente grew. Now, when a city is unincorporated, oftentimes there isn't a lot of design review or design control over the architecture. So Dana Point grew in any sort of style they wanted. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different styles. Certainly there's some high density housing, but it grew very, very fast. The other thing about Dana Point, homeowners associations became very popular. And these homeowners associations sometimes are gated, sometimes they're not. They tend to have their own architectural theme. But I think the problem is they sort of don't contribute to the overall theme of the community. Each neighborhood has their own theme. Now, if you look at Dana Point, it has a plethora of homeowners associations. It has actually about 70 of them. So in some senses, it's hard to develop a real design theme if you have so many different homeowners associations. The other thing about Dana Point is they decided their arterials, the coast highway, was so wide and big that they wanted to make it more pedestrian friendly. So what they did is they went back into history and they looked at the original Spanish colonial designs, and they decided also to bring back the lanterns. And the lanterns of Dana Point were originally placed by Sidney Woodruff. There's golden lantern, violet lantern, amber lantern, blue lantern, and they're absolutely beautiful. And these lanterns were actually on the boats that came into the Dana Point Bay to advertise what they were selling. So the city, I think they've done a great job. They've brought back the lantern streets in the oldest part of Dana Point, the original area that was designed by Sidney Woodruff. And they built what I think is, I like street spanning arches. They put a street spanning arch, which is an entrance to the lantern district where the historic lanterns are. And there's mosaics and historical placards. I think that they did a nice job. They also widened the sidewalks. They put some drought-tolerant landscaping in. They put seating areas. So I think Dana Point is really trying to revitalize their downtown. Now, this is kind of interesting. About 15 years ago, the city had a big debate. Are we going to build a true town center? And they brought in an urban design company called Roma, and they did a series of design drawings and design charrettes. And this shows what's happening to Dana Point. Some people think it's overdevelopment. Some people think it's going to make it a lot more popular. So take a look at what graphics can do. So here's the street as it exists now. This is Del Prado Street. As it develops, you can see they're bringing larger buildings. And if it's a multi-story building, they're moving it back from the sidewalk. You can see they're encouraging wall signs and awnings, wider sidewalks, and street fairs. Here's another street. It's very car-oriented. It's pretty terrible for the pedestrian, but you can see over time, when they bring in better signs, better design review, they're gonna have a denser fabric and there'll be better public space. So this should be Dana Point in about 5 years. So you can see Dana Point has really gone through some changes. It started as a stopover for Richard Henry Dana and the cowhide trade. Then it developed into a famous Spanish colonial town by Sidney Woodruff, one of the developers of Hollywood. Then it became a great surf destination, and then it decided to build a town center and bring history back. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at Dana Point, one of our wonderful neighbors in Orange County, and I hope you enjoy our video.